Hello, and welcome to the PRGX webinar, Shared Services, Managing Risk and Finding Opportunity in a Remote Environment. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please submit using the webinar question box. Also, please check your audio. If you're having trouble hearing us, you can let us know in the question box as well. And be sure to follow us on our social channels, Twitter and LinkedIn, by searching PRGX Global. We'd also like to let you know about our upcoming Source to Pay Thought Leadership Series, PRG Exchange Virtual. This complimentary event will take place October 20th through 22nd, and there will be 6 sessions covering a range of topics, including source to pay, general business, and how current events are impacting source to pay practitioners and professionals. And all of the sessions are designed to benefit attendees, both professionally and personally. Today, during this webinar, Shared Services, Managing Risk and Finding Opportunity in a Remote Environment, Danielle Adamson and Don Leverage will discuss challenges shared services centers have faced this year and how these may lead to revenue leakage, and share recommendations and solutions for consideration. Danielle Adamson is our Director of Client Services for PRGX. She's a career client services professional with a focus in technology and financial service organizations, with 15 years experience in procure-to-pay automation and 10 years experience in recovery audit with Fortune 100 clients. Don Leverage is a Senior Audit Director for PRGX and has over 24 years of retail audit experience. He has served clients in verticals ranging from grocery to electronics, both in the US and globally. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
To start, could you both share a little bit about how shared services centers were set up or structured prior to the crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the shared service centers that we're accustomed to were very large teams, centralized location, allowing for a lot of collaboration. For example, here at PRGX in West Michigan, we actually have what we call pods, and they consist of 8 to 10 people, and there's probably, 10 to 15 pods that typically work together. What that allows us to do is just to really collaborate with each other, asking each other what we're working on, what works, what doesn't, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's typically the setup. It is usually a very centralized environment. It's either onshore or offshore. Those when you talk about shared services teams anymore, a lot of those are now located offshore, but they're usually structured much the same. Very centralized group of people working together.
And so can you kind of share with us a little bit about how those setups have changed?
Well, the first most obvious change was, everybody had to go home. So suddenly, instead of that centralized, easy access to your teammates, everybody is now located, in a distributed, far, environment, and these kinds of changes suddenly do present challenges, and they had to happen immediately. This wasn't something that people had time to plan for. So, one minute everybody's together, they're all able to collaborate easily, they're, talking to each other. The next minute, everybody's at home, and we've all got to try to keep productivity going.
Absolutely. And we also saw, due to the immediateness of this situation, and we also saw that roles changed, right? So some people were furloughed, some people who were working full time had a reduction in hours, some people were just laid off completely. So lots of change within that move.
And because, as you mentioned, it was a very swift, quick transition, can you share some of the issues that you've heard about when the teams had to move to a work from home setting?
One of the first things that came up were just the pure technical challenges. Fortunately, this happened in a time when most people have high-speed internet at home. If this had happened 5 or 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been as widespread as it is today. But once that hurdle is over, then the worry, and there was a lot of talk about this in industry wide, can the internet actually support all this increased traffic? I mean, you're not only sending everybody home to work, but many people were laid off. Many people lost their jobs. Suddenly, what are those people doing all day when there's no jobs to even look for? Well, they're probably sitting home streaming Netflix or some other streaming content. So the network traffic across internet providers was just huge. And that actually didn't turn out to be much of a problem in the United States. But in parts of Europe, it was. There were areas of Europe that saw, very reduced speeds for internet activity, and that created productivity decreases for people who were trying to work from home. And in fact, streaming services like Netflix and YouTube reduced the quality of the feeds they put out in order to put less stress on the system during that time. And another thing we don't often think about in parts of the world that we take certain things for granted, but back to the India as a shared services environment, it turns out that there are a number of cities in India that have rolling blackouts during the day for power. They've usually been limited to the residential parts of those cities to make sure power is available to the more commercial and industrial parts of the city. Well, now everybody went home and is working from home in the parts of the city that have rolling blackouts. And a number of teams found that they had downtime during the day because their team members would suddenly lose electricity for some window of time. So issues that we don't even think about. Well, once you get past that, there was company infrastructure. It's different when everybody's located on site using the company infrastructure from internal. Everybody's on the system internally. Now everybody goes home, and suddenly the system has to accommodate every single employee making an external connection request to the system. In some cases, that just wasn't possible, and there was reconfiguration or upgrades. Which means cost involved. And again, immediately, nobody knew that this was an issue until suddenly everybody tried to work from home. So you're counting on production today and everybody can't get on. So it became a very drop everything and solve this problem right now kind of issue. One other thing that we don't think about very often anymore is access to hard copy documentation. Over the last, 10, 20, 30 years, we keep hearing about moving to, a paperless society. And we've done a tremendous amount along those lines. And, in many industries, it's very close to that, but not 100%. And some industries are more dependent upon paper than others. Well, if everybody goes home and is basically denied access to the company, offices, how do they access, something that doesn't exist in a digital world when they need it to do their job? So some places had to modify the work from home situation to provide at least limited numbers of people access to some documents that only exist on site.
Yeah, and Don, you mentioned the connectivity. We also had hardware issues, right? Like, you're basically duplicating your workstation at home. Whether that means, go out and get new laptops and bases and all of that set up, or try to physically move your existing equipment. The problem with physically moving the equipment is that most of those big towers were hardwired for connectivity, so they don't have the wireless adapters, or you had to get a wireless adapter for those. So we saw, a wide range of that, and then on top of that, to your point earlier, we're all working from home, including our IT groups. So now you've got an end user like maybe me, who isn't very technically savvy. So trying to teach me how to install a wireless adapter, it's going to take some time and effort, and probably frustration on their side, right? And we also saw, collaboration is another area where we've seen significant change. Whereas you used to walk up and down the hall and be able to communicate with your coworkers, that's just not taking place, clearly. So, and you can't really put a value on that until it's not there. So we've tried to do a lot of things like, as well as everybody else, we're doing like team Zoom lunches together, just to kind of bring everybody back to a place where we can kind of start talking about, but It's awkward in the beginning, and then, you know, as you do it more, I think people got more comfortable and were better at it.
Well, and that collaboration issue creates management problems. You know, managers and supervisors, you know, had access to their people. You know, one day you can walk out and have a conversation or an impromptu team meeting or, you know, whatever you needed to do to communicate information. And suddenly now that has to be a much more conscious effort and takes more organization. It takes more time. You know, it created issues for, you know, things like how to monitor whether people were working the hours they reported they worked. You know, in a perfect world, everybody's completely honest and above board, but, you know, in the real world, there's some monitoring activity that does need to take place from a management perspective. You know, how to measure productivity accurately from home, how to assign work, you know, and how to motivate employees. You know, all the employees went home. But, you know, those with kids, all their kids were home too. All the schools were closed. So you've got people trying to, you know, put in an honest day's work at home and stay focused on their tasks at hand. And they're not in an environment that may be the most conducive to productivity because they've got all of their kids at home and they're trying to, you know, deal with all those distractions. But, you know, one of the most difficult things that we saw was training. I think, you know, almost every employee engagement survey or any kind of, you know, survey of organizations puts training as something that every organization feels like they could do a better job of. There's already a perceived lack of competence in training. Now, when you move everybody home and you're trying to figure out how am I going to train all these people through, you know, screen sharing, you know, Teams meetings, Zoom calls, it's less efficient, it's less effective, and it becomes much more difficult. You know, one example I know of, you know, there had been a team that had hired between 6 and 8 people within the 3 months prior to COVID hitting and having to send them all home. Well, you've got very new people and you're trying to, you know, conduct that ongoing training from, you know, in a remote environment. And I know in this case, the minute the local government agency allowed for, you know, like 25% capacity in the office space, that was the group that they wanted to get back in, along with 2 people that could act as trainers. And they felt like within 2 weeks of having those people back in the office, they made more progress than they had in 4 months at home. So that's been a tremendous challenge for most organizations. You know, and all of that means managers and supervisors are spending a, you know, much higher percentage of their time engaged in communication type activities, Zoom calls, Teams meetings, conference calls, one-on-one with employees that may have particular needs or be having some issues. You know, it's just taking up a tremendous amount of their time, you know, creating less time for other things that used to be part of their job.
So, you know, considering the information that you just shared around collaboration, fewer resources, you know, having to get more done with limited hours, limited people, technical issues, you know, one would guess that there had to be an impact and that potential or additional errors started to present themselves. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those errors were and, you know, what teams are, what they're seeing and some of the causes for those errors?
You know, one of the things that's been interesting to me throughout the years of observing different organizations, even pre-COVID, watching companies go through layoffs or furloughs that was only exacerbated by COVID, is the amount of knowledge that exists about a company's ERP system only in a few people's heads. You know, many systems have been in place for 10, 15, 20 plus years. There's usually a few go-to people that everybody knows when the system doesn't do what I think it's supposed to, you know, this person can solve it. When there is an error, when there's a known limitation that I need to work around, you know, what about this odd process or this, you know, unusual transaction? Well, you go talk to them, they'll figure out how to make it work. And if those people have been furloughed, you've lost that legacy knowledge. You know, it's interesting to think that you would assume that your IT group would actually be kind of the repository of that type of knowledge. But in many cases, companies have gone to outsourced IT groups. So you have an external firm trying to provide your IT services, and you may have changed IT service providers multiple times since you instituted your systems. that means they may not be the absolute best resource for, why a system was designed a certain way, or how it handles certain things, or the complete interconnectedness of how one system talks to another, and how they interrelate. So, the loss of some very key long-term employees can create tremendous challenges, at least in the short term, and create far more chances for errors and for some leakage to occur through the system.
Yeah, you talk about ERP systems. I actually had a client who went live with a brand new ERP system during this whole situation with the working from home, and talk about it taking twice as long than it normally would have. You mentioned the training, so you've got the training and the testing that they had to do beforehand too, that they were trying to do remotely, and you miss those one-on-one, face-to-face conversations. They just get lost, and it's hard to explain. I feel like face-to-face conversation is always better than an email. So just kind of changes the game there. We've also noticed that 90 to 95% of what we do is automated, but there's always those one-offs, those manual tasks that still take place. Sometimes that's on an Excel spreadsheet, sometimes that's just on a notebook beside you. It's all over the place. And to your point about the furloughs, I had another client who had gone through some furlough activity, and one of the individuals was one responsible for getting W-8s. Now, unfortunately, that wasn't, in the list of all of their job descriptions that, that they kind of understood until after it was too late, and some of those W-8s weren't captured. So it was a great opportunity for us to be able to help them, though, go out and acquire those. So it's making sure that the individuals who are getting furloughed, you kind of understand everything that they do to make sure that you're not having any gaps.
Yeah, and that's a good point that, many companies have found that as they've lost people, or as the system has been put under increased stress during this time, that their strategic partners that they've been engaged with can provide maybe even non-traditional services for them, to serve as kind of a force multiplier to backstop some of the internal functions. COVID put an enormous amount of stress on most organizations. Even if they were able to move people home, there were a tremendous amount of disruptions to the normal flow of operations. My particular background is pretty heavy on the retail side, and retailers faced, the complete, the whole increased demand problem. We all saw the product shortages in the store where you couldn't find things, and, that huge uptick in demand had to be resolved. And again, you're dealing with people that are mostly trying to do this from home, trying to, figure out how to, bridge these gaps. One other aspect to that is that there's some increased cost to that. With the supply chain issues for retailers, and for example, you move from a situation where you are able to optimize everything, you're able to make sure things operate at minimum cost, to a situation where you are scrambling. Let's take toilet paper, for instance. We all saw the weeks where it was very difficult to find toilet paper, and, people were starting to wonder, okay, what's my plan B here? What am I going to go to if this keeps going very much longer? Well, in that environment, a retailer is probably going to take whatever product they can get whenever they can get it. So they moved from a situation where they probably were, pretty insistent on, very specific shipping requirements to, hey, I don't care if the truck's a third full. If you've got something, bring it. But that's an increased marginal freight cost. And that's just, kind of one small example of how, the system was put under increased cost pressure. And in that window of time, one area that companies have turned to, is the recovery audit. The recovery audit teams may be instituting a recovery audit if they don't have one already. Some of the benefits to that can be, first of all, just peace of mind. you know that somebody else is looking at everything. With all the time that we've talked about with managers and supervisors spent in, new communication type activities, some of the activities they used to do as part of their day job, maybe they had a pretty tight lid on certain cost containment efforts. They may not have time to do that right now. And to know that you've brought in somebody else that can, again, act as kind of a force multiplier to bridge those gaps, to serve as a backstop, to, go through every transaction, every contract, every, payment that they make, whatever that industry's, key areas are, they can go through that information and make sure that there is somebody out there, in addition to the internal staff, that is working to, minimize leakage and maximize profitability.
Yeah, you totally get into that old adage of you don't know what you don't know, which, sounds redundant, but really isn't. In those situations, you can be lulled into a false sense of security, just because you don't understand what things are really going on. But introducing an audit will absolutely allow you to open your eyes, and the audit process goes further and identifies the source of the trouble, and then assist in diagnosing some root cause involvement.
Yeah, and with all these costs that we talked about, there is a real need for organizations to find ways to offset those costs. They're facing a lot of new areas of cost that weren't planned into the budget. Everybody knew their existing cost structures. They had their products priced in a way to overcome those. But now suddenly you've got a whole new cost line. Well, recovery audit is a way to find some of those existing areas of leakage that maybe didn't move the meter prior to COVID. Maybe you weren't, a company wasn't feeling motivated by some of that. But now with, the increased cost pressure, it can be, one tool in the toolbox to find some additional, some additional savings, to return some additional profitability back into the organization and help mitigate some of those cost increases.
Absolutely.
And what about from a contract perspective, existing contracts, that would now be a good time to review some of those?
Absolutely. I personally believe that it would be fiscally irresponsible not to at any time. But now is a great time to make sure that you are actually getting what you negotiated for, and taking it all the way back to the contract, not just the transaction level.
Very good. So what I'm hearing you guys say is that, actually now is a really good time to consider an audit or start an audit.
Yeah, I would think so, for all the reasons we talked about, the benefits it can provide. In addition, post-audit, recovery audit does not have to be a tremendous cost up front. In most cases, the upfront costs are pretty low, as there is frequently things are done on a contingency basis, so there's no cost unless there's recoveries. There is a pretty high degree of knowledge in most recovery audit firms on how to interact with your internal teams to minimize their disruption, the cost of time and resources internally to make something happen. It's really something that can happen relatively seamlessly.
Well, and also they typically happen remote. Even before COVID, everything is in the data, so we're not having to go to our clients and pull invoices anymore, and that kind of activity. So we can do that remote. And as you mentioned, you can extend them and leverage them as part of your team to help you meet your goals.
Yeah.
So we've talked, about pre-crisis, the current environment. What do you guys see as the setup going forward for shared services teams?
Well, I think, right now it's limited to any office activity before the end of the year. I think, to John's point, it's going to be those one-off things like, we need to bring people in so that we can do further training, getting them up to speed. And I really do think it's based on the culture of the organization. I'm guessing it's going to be more of a staggered type schedule when we go back, and it may just be like it may not ever be back to full in-office work.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like, and the people we talk to, that anybody's in too big of a hurry to come back. And in some localities, the, governmental restrictions are still not permitting, full return to work, and may not for some time. So, it's starting to feel like, for a long time, we heard people talk about, well, we're kind of shooting for Labor Day. Maybe Labor Day is kind of a milestone. Maybe we can bring people back by then. Well, that came and went. So now, you start hearing people talk about, next year. It's starting to feel a little bit like a lot of companies kind of plan B or C or D by this point, is maybe we look out to next year before we start looking to, be anywhere close to full in-office capacity.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions that you would offer should we ever be faced with this type of a crisis situation again?
Well, it's interesting. We all talk about disaster planning and disaster recovery. But this has highlighted the fact that we've all probably had a little too narrow a description of what a disaster is. If you have a company that's located, along the Gulf Coast or, down in Florida, close to the coast, you probably have a hurricane disaster plan. But very few organizations had a global pandemic disaster plan. I just don't think this was something that most of us saw on the horizon. There may have been a few, but not many. And it's just kind of highlighted the fact that we all need to do a better job and take a broader view of what a disaster can be. I mean, what truly is the worst case scenario? And something that used to be, you would think would only be in a Hollywood movie, suddenly became reality. And we all were caught a little bit by surprise, but I think this has served as a valuable teaching tool to let us all know, worst case may be possible. We need to have a really, really comprehensive disaster plan that doesn't just plan for an act of nature.
Yeah, I would agree.
Great. Well, everything that you've shared today, it's all great information. There were a couple of questions. Let me pull that. So this is all helpful for the current situation, working from home. What should be considered for us as we and our teams do start to return to the office?
Well, I think, one thing that, talking to clients we serve and just working through our own issues, I believe that, a best practice coming out of this is definitely going to be to have, kind of a playbook. You're going to need to think through the issues that need to be planned for. Some of those are likely to include facility access. Current foot traffic may go past the same people, multiple times a day. Well, maybe you need to plan to have some people entering through a different door than others. So, maybe this particular pod of employees doesn't have all foot traffic going past it for every restroom break all day long. Maybe there is, what is your plans around PPE? Are people going to be required to wear masks only in common area spaces? Is it going to be while they're at their desks all day? How about cleaning routines? So how are you going to disinfect things? But, to Danielle's point, that a lot of times it looks like the return is going to be staggered. That it does feel like people are coming back in phases. And let's face it, a lot of our people have liked working from home. They want to continue working from home, even if we think that there is still a lot of value in having people together. But, if we create a return to work plan that includes multiple phases, but has no logic to who gets put into what phase, there's an HR issue involved there where suddenly you get some complaints, you get some feedback. Why am I coming back first, but Bill doesn't have to come back for another 6 weeks? So thinking around what logic underpins each phase. Is this particular team, is there a reason why this team can be defined as needing to be back sooner than others? And, making sure that those phases are tied to job codes, job functions, particular teams, as much as possible to make them seem less arbitrary.
Yeah, I've also seen, I've got a client that used this time as really practice for not coming back. They had a goal, an organizational goal to reduce their office space by 50%. And that was announced before the pandemic. And so everybody kind of giggled and said, there's no way we'll hit that. And then we all have been working very successfully from home. So that really has been their goal is, okay, now we know that we can definitely do it. So let's keep practicing and what is it going to take?
So we've got a couple others, and I think we've got a little bit of time. So you spoke of errors because of the work from home situation. And you also touched on that a lot of providers do offer best practices if errors are found. Can you share a little bit more around how those are, the information that's shared with your clients to hopefully and potentially avoid these errors in the future?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, we provide root cause information on the claim level. So, for example, instead of just coming back to you and telling you that it's a duplicate payment, we're going to tell you what caused the duplicate. So, if it was because your supplier invoiced you twice versus a key punch error, the resolution to that looks very different. So we make sure that we're giving you as much information as we can. We also have either biweekly or quarter or monthly meetings where we're sitting down and going through the different items. Anything that we see that's big that we want to draw your attention to, we do that at those meetings. And then we try to sit down on a very regular basis and go over more of a holistic view of the audit. What areas are we finding the most, and then make recommendations.
Yeah, and those root cause, that root cause feedback is really important. It's been interesting over the years to see that some organizations are very, very quick and able to react to root cause analysis like that, and they can make changes that will close those gaps. Others may find that more of a struggle. And it may just be based around size. A very, very large, global operation may not be able to make a change immediately to close, one particular gap. And, frankly, it may not be cost effective. I mean, they might do a cost benefit analysis and say, it's only going to cost me X to have somebody find that every year, but it's going to cost me a multiple of X to try to figure out how to reprogram something or change a huge system in order to to close that relatively small gap. But it all just depends on the size of the of the miss, the size of the leakage, and the perceived cost to make any kind of internal changes that might mitigate it.
Great. And we have one final question. During this time, what resources are required to begin a recovery audit program?
Well, I mean, first, you're going to need some access to IT. However, recovery audit firms are pretty used to starting engagements. They're pretty used to getting data. Data is the key to everything. Data. But most of them are very, very good at data acquisition. They're going to be able to interact with internal IT departments in the most efficient way possible. And in many cases, they may have ready-made solutions for that team. Hey, for your system, here is a script, or here is a method that we know works to export these known tables that we're going to need to conduct the audit. It may not be that far down the road, but they probably will be able to provide a lot of support, a lot of resource type knowledge on how to get the data that's needed. There probably will be some, there will have to be some interaction with whoever the business owner internally is going to be. Some organizations, that's a merchandising group, and some organization that resides with finance. But somebody inside the organization does need to make some decisions about how we want this service provider to represent us. I mean, because that's what a recovery audit firm is. They're a representative of an organization, and they are standing in proxy of that organization to their vendor community, to whoever that they is the transactional element of that business. And they have a responsibility, and the internal groups have a responsibility to make sure that the organization is being represented the way they want. But that's not so much a time occupier. It just means that there just needs to be a little thought, some decisions around guidelines. What is our approach going to be? How do we want this group to represent us to the wider world? But really, the internal touch should be relatively minimal.
Okay. Danielle, anything that you would add to that, or?
Nope, I would just echo that it should be relatively minimal time requirements. We've been doing this for a very long time, and pretty much everything is scripted, even our questions that we're going to ask during those first initial interviews, as well as the getting of the data. So we kind of walk through that, and I mean, our goal is to give you back time. So.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for attending our conversation today, and a big thank you to our panelists, Danielle Adamson and Don Leverage. This recording will be added to the PRGX website in the resources section, along with our other on-demand webinars. We do also have some additional webinars scheduled for over the next few months, covering a range of topics, and as well our PRG Exchange virtual series. So if you are interested in any of those, you can access registration for these via our resources section in the PRGX website. Also, if you would like to know more about recovery audit or to speak with a PRGX expert, please visit our website as well at prgx.com. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.